Good afternoon to our director, Fadi Srivas Rajmanikam, our Dean of the Medical College, Dr. George D'Souza, Dean of St. John's Research Institute, Dr. Tony Raj, Sister Dr. Vijaya Sharma, Dr. Bernadette Nirmal Kumar, and very importantly, Dr. M.J. Thomas, Dr. Maya Thomas, and Rohit, who's joining us from Vietnam. On behalf of the St. John's Medical College Alumni Association, it is my privilege to welcome everyone present here today and those joining us online from across the globe to the 41st Dr. Jayashree Thomas Memorial Oration. The first Dr. Jayashree Thomas Oration was started in 1984 and has had many notable St. John's and CMC alumni orators, and today will be no exception. I would like to call Dr. Rajalakshmi, HOD Department of Pathology, to speak about Dr. Jayashree Thomas.
Very good afternoon to everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to speak a few words about Dr. Jayashree Thomas. And over the years, I really wish I knew her. So Dr. Jayashree Thomas was a Johnite of the batch of 1968, and she completed her MBBS in 1975. She was excellent at academics. She stood first in anatomy, physiology, forensic medicine, and OBG, and she was awarded the prestigious Pope Paul Prize for Best Outgoing Student in 1974. She also received the President's Silver Medal for standing first among all women candidates appearing for MBBS exams that year. Pathology was her passion from her undergraduate days, and she joined the department as a resident in 1975 and as a tutor in 1976. During this period, she accomplished a research project titled Fallopian tube morphology in the normal and abnormal menstrual cycle, which was awarded the Dean Louis Montero Prize. In 1977, she joined CMC Vellore for MD Pathology, in which she excelled. With a flawless record and a desire to enrich her alma mater, she returned to St. John's as Assistant Professor of Pathology. And within a short span of 2 years, she authored 6 publications, 4 of them in international journals, a further testimony to her brilliance. In addition to being an exemplary student and researcher, Dr. Jayashree is remembered as a gentle, affectionate colleague and an innovative teacher. Her meticulousness is evident to this day in the collection of books which were kindly donated by her family to our department library. The neatly handwritten notes at the end of every chapter are a pleasure to behold. Cooking was another of her passions, and her colleagues will bear testimony to this, so they used to enjoy her treats often. A brilliant student, an esteemed colleague, and a loyal, well-loved friend. These were the words written by Professor John Thomas on 8th May 1982, a day after Dr. Jayashree left her loved ones prematurely. And this sentiment is echoed by every single person who knew her. In her fond memory, the SGMC Alumni Association instituted this annual oration from the year 1984. The first speaker was Professor Anand Date, the head of pathology at CMC Vellore, and the most recent one in 2023 was delivered by Dr. R.R. Baliga. It's been my privilege to introduce Dr. Jayashree today, and I thank the Alumni Association for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajalakshmi. And now, to introduce our orator today, Professor Dr. Bernadette Nirmal Kumar, we have her close friend and batchmate, Dr. Maria Auguste. Good afternoon, all the dignitaries, our dear teachers, fellow Johnites, and friends. I'm so happy and honored to introduce my batchmate and a dear friend, a well-deserving person to deliver the 2024
Jayashree Thomas Oration. Nirmal, as we call her, belongs to the 1993 batch of MBBS at St. John's, and then she went on to do DMD in surgery in Delhi. After that, it was a long journey. She worked for organizations like UNICEF, WHO, World Bank, and World Food Program in countries like South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Gaza, West Bank, North Korea, and China in different capacities over the next 10 years. By then, she identified her calling and completed PhD in epidemiology and public health from the University of Oslo, followed by a postdoctoral research fellowship in psychiatry, again from University of Oslo. She was also appointed Professor of Global Health at the Institute for Health and Society, University of Oslo in 2013. These are some of the coveted positions that she's currently holding. Special Advisor, Norwegian Institute of Public Health, President of the European Association of Public Health Section for Migration and Ethnic Minority Health, Chair of the Global Society on Migration, Ethnicity, Race and Health, Co-Chair for Lancet Migration, Professor, Empire School of Health, India, Affiliated Professor, School of Medicine, Kathmandu University, Vice President, Women in Global Health Advisory Board, Norway Chapter, and Strategic Advisor, Center for Immigrant, Refugee and Global Health, City University, New York. There is an equally staggering list of her past positions, which I will not have time to mention today. Many years of experience across continents, working with governments and the UN, opened her eyes to the need for an upstream action in healthcare policy making. She is part of several prestigious international and national steering committees and boards, which includes the post of a special advisor for the Prime Minister's Norway-India Partnership Initiative to reduce maternal and child mortality in India, and being a director of Norwegian Center for Migration and Ethnic Minority Health. Her priorities are research, health policy and strategy, and mentoring, especially that of next generation researchers. Migration and health has been the focus of her research since 1999, particularly inequalities in global health, migrant and ethnic minority health. She has over 150 publications, 7 research grants, and academic collaborations to her credit. She is also editor of 2 textbooks on migrant health. In her own words, her personal skills include developing and evolving strategies and bridging the gap between technical expertise, strategy, and policy. From an impressive Lancet profile of hers, I came to know some stories about her for the first time. In 1990, when she spent 6 months as a volunteer in Sudan during a civil conflict, Nirmal and a colleague were held hostage by the rebels for 3 days, and the US Secretary of State had to intervene for the release. Again, in her own words, I love work, getting mud on my boots. It was hard work, as we were starting from scratch with no data registries and no baseline information. And to us, Nirmal is a very dear classmate and a loving friend. She's a selfless human being, simple, down to earth, an extremely generous person. Her room was always open to all, and she was known for her cooking skills that most of us have enjoyed. An unstoppable cheerleader and one with amazing people skills. Even in those days, she was good at strategizing for the class, especially for the girls. She's extremely talented, particularly in music, dramatics, and literature. Nirmal gave her 100% to everything that she did. And she was also very much part of all the fun. Even now, despite her busy schedule, she always makes time to be with the batch whenever we meet. She has been for many years a great support for our sister doctors, not just with her time and resources, but she also shares their dreams and helps turn them into reality. In the words of Dr. Sister Lisa, our classmate, human development is in her blood. Yes, Lily, we all are so proud of you and are waiting to hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Mary, for that small snapshot into the many facets of Dr. Burnett. And now, please join me in welcoming our orator for the 41st Dr. Jayashree Thomas Memorial Oration, Professor Dr. Bernadette Nirmal Kumar.
Thank you so much, Mary. After that, I don't think I can talk, and I'm never at a loss for words. So it was really generous and very kind of you to do that. And it's also really a pleasure and a privilege and a great honor to be here today. Dear directors, dear deans, dear dignitaries, dear Dr. Thomas, MJ, and Maya, and the family, and of course, all my fellow Joinites, my classmates, batchmates, and my dear family and friends who are also here, and all of you who are watching. It is indeed a big challenge to live up to all the expectations that Mary has so kindly outlined, and I will try to do my best. I have a very big topic, and as you have probably heard, I am interested in so many things. So what I would like to say at the outset is fasten your seatbelts, because this is going to be a whirlwind tour. I think the first thing I'd like to start off, because we're talking about global health challenges, is really looking at the world, and you see the world, the planet Earth, as a patient. We've been using Band-Aid very long, and we all know when you use Band-Aid, what happens. Because the planet is now a multicultural planet, there's a lot of diversity. And as that says in Norwegian, if you don't like that, then please move to another planet. And we might have to, because we are not looking after planet Earth. We also know that diversity, which has been very much part of our culture in India, is not something to fear, but we do fear it. And it is not our differences that divide us, really, but it's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And I am going to talk about these differences. So what I'm going to talk about is wicked problems. I don't know if you know what wicked problems are. It's not what you're thinking. Some key concepts, because there are different concepts and they mean different things to different people. I'm going to make a case for migration and health. And the next question is, so what? And finally, the title, why we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. You're probably wondering what that is about. So let's start with wicked problems. I would like to describe wicked problems as the fox, because wicked problems are problems where we don't have data, where there's no end or solution in sight, where there are many stakeholders who are at conflict with each other's, where the solutions are costly, where it's difficult to define, socially complex, and the issues are interconnected. So what we're used to is it's no longer 2 + 2, which is the simple systems known solution, but it's complicated systems and getting them scaled up. And in healthcare and in health, we know that all too often. Examples of wicked problems, I'm just going to give them to you, and then you can see that they rarely occur in isolation. Climate change, conflict, pandemics, poverty, food security, racial inequality, urbanization, data privacy, to mention a few. There's not a single field where there are not wicked problems, and they all occur together. And the question is, how do we deal with these wicked problems? So from these wicked problems, a bit more closely, and you're thinking, this is not a good slide. We know what's killing us. It's cancer, it's cardiovascular disease, it's all of these things. Yes, it's true. But if you look at what's really killing us, it's not that alone. And there are some differences. For example, even in Oslo, in Norway, one of the richest countries in the world, you'll see that on the eastern part of the city, that life expectancy is 9 years shorter than on the western part. A child who's born in a Glasgow suburb can expect a life 28 years shorter than one living only 13 kilometers away. A girl in Lesotho is likely to live 42 years less than another in Japan. And in Sweden, the risk of a woman dying during pregnancy and childbirth is 1 in 17,400, whereas in Afghanistan, the odds are 1 in 8. And yes, some of it is biology, but biology cannot explain all of it. Instead, the differences between and within countries result from the social environment where people are born, live, grow, work, and age. And then we have to say, is this because we are not treated fairly? And you can see the man saying to these animals, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the exam, please climb that tree. And we know that's not going to be fair. So we have to, the principles of equity and equality are often very mixed up. Equality is sameness, and equality is important. For example, we need equality when it comes to the law, but it only works if everyone starts from the same place. Whereas equity is fairness. It means access to the same opportunities. We also have heard about burden and health disparities, but these are also not the same. Burdens are those where the difference in numbers affected, larger the number, the greater the burden. And we often talk about the burden of disease, the global burden of disease. And disparity is where that difference, the health difference, is linked with social or economic disadvantage. So therefore, we have all these distinctions among the concepts: disparity, inequity, inequality, burden. And all of these things need and require different research questions and different applications to policy, practice, and programs. I'm not going to go all through it because for the students, please read up later on. But coming down to equity in healthcare, why are we so concerned with equity in healthcare? Because what we're trying to do is eliminate all the systematic differences in health status between socioeconomic groups. And in equity in healthcare, we also see that we have to match the services to the level of need, which means it actually means favoring disadvantaged groups. So what it means quite simply is availability of health facilities and personnel, accessibility to those services, acceptability of the services, because people are not going to come and avail of services if they're not acceptable, and above all, the quality of healthcare. And we see that all too often. We need to understand where these health inequity gaps come from. So I've already mentioned inequity in access and quality of healthcare. We also see financial insecurity, particularly when there are out-of-pocket expenses for healthcare, not being able to make the ends meet. We also know that people who are socially disadvantaged, living in poor quality housing and neighborhood, have also difficulties in accessing. And the higher levels of social exclusion is more in disadvantaged groups, and there are many disadvantaged groups. And of course, a lack of decent work and poor working conditions. So if we look at that, we can see that actually only 10% really of the inequity, health inequity gaps are due to healthcare. So all of us who work in healthcare can say, okay, that's not our problem, it's somebody else's problem. And it's true, it's not only our problem. But when we look at healthcare, where do we see that there are differences? And the differences are in quality, availability, and affordability of health services. And for that, we see that a lot of the time, the inequities come with provision of health services, unaffordable services, and unmet needs of different populations. So, and I'm showing you this for Europe, and I'll come back to why the data like this is not available for a lot of the rest of the world. So the reality check. What is the reality? There are significant variations in health status, and there always will be. There are significant variations in access and experience of receiving healthcare. Significant variation in the evidence base. That is, where does the research come from? Where do we have the data from? And of course, the very famous Julian Tudor Hart, the inverse care law. That is, those who need the services are not those who get the services, but those who perhaps need them least are the ones who get them most. So that is where we are. Within social inequalities, and social inequalities is not a new field, but the global perspective was we need health for all, because it doesn't help if one group is very healthy. And in 1980, the very famous Black Report came, which talked about poverty. After that came the Whitehall study talking about the gradient. And then came the research on causation and the very famous WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. And of course, the EU is working very closely on closing the gap, and the Marmot report. But if we are to approach these inequities, how do we approach them? It's a very huge area. So we have to look at local inequalities, and we see them in age, gender, education, family status. They're part of every day. And this, of course, you see whether you're a clinician, whether you're working in the community, or you're sitting with policy making. However, the spatial, environmental, and geographic inequalities are not necessarily something that you reflect on every day in a clinical practice. But they definitely influence mobility, decision-making, and outcomes, including access to what would be some of the underlying causes, like transportation, education, and healthcare opportunities. And the global inequalities are historical and develop over time. So approaching them is a bit like this, as you can see. Let's have a look at Europe, because we do assume that everything in Europe is very hunky-dory and healthcare is great. But we can see that there are lots of educational inequalities, and this is inequalities related to mortality among men. And you would assume that mortality among men was better than women. And you'll see the differences that, of course, though mortality rates are coming down, there's a very clear gradient between low educated men and high educated men. And we also see that there's a social divide. And the social divide is very interesting, and you would not think of it. It's an east-west divide between Eastern and Western Europe. And there's also a divide that you see that comes in with looking at how do we narrow the inequalities. So social inequalities in healthcare are still there, though they are going the right way. Now, if we look at the European countries and looking at their advancement in tackling health, looking at the same data that we have on inequalities, we can basically divide Europe into three. You have countries where the evaluation shows that the social gradient is good, and you have countries like Finland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Austria, and Germany. And the question for them is, yes, they have reduced some of the inequalities, but they have to do better. Whereas we see that countries in the middle, they can do more: Belgium, Denmark, Spain, Netherlands, Italy, France. And then you have countries in Eastern Europe, and you remember the gradient from the previous graph that I showed you, where they have to do some. So everybody is not on the same page, and everybody doesn't need to do the same. We all have to do what we can. Now the question of global health. How global is global health, really? And you look at this and you see that the headquarters of 198 global organizations active in health and health policy across the globe. And what do you see? You see that 80% are in higher income countries. What I haven't put here, and I already apologize to the male members of this audience, 80% are led by men and 70% are from high income countries. So there is a disparity. Global health is really not global. And then if you look at the alignment of the global burden of disease compared to organizational priorities, it is not as if we are addressing the problems that we need to address. So we see, when we look at the proportion of burden of disease, men and women, and you look at NCDs, and you look at where the funders are funding, you will see that the NCDs are not the top funded. So there is a mismatch here, and there are disparities. And of course, this makes it a challenge for us to really try to reduce the inequalities. But inequality is a political choice. Much of the inequality today is a result of government policy, or it's not only what the government does, but it's also what it does not do. So it's very important to understand that this is not the way it is. It doesn't have to be, it is a choice. I will now move on to focus a little bit more, because global health priorities are really huge and it is impossible for me to try and cover everything. So I'm going to look at what I call the 3 C's. And if we had time for a quiz or a mentometer, I would ask you to identify the pictures. The first one you see here is very easy. It's climate change. Second one, I hope, is also very easy. That's COVID-19 pandemics. And the third one, I hope, is also easy to recognize. It's conflict. And what happens in these situations? What is a cross-cutting issue for all these three global health priorities? It is basically migration, because migration introduces new sources of risk, increased health burdens, increased push and pull, and there is differential risk, differential exposure, and differential consequences. So let's look at climate change and who is impacted most by the environment. And you will see here, I'm sorry that this slide is in Norwegian, but you will see that the worst offenders when it comes to climate change are not low and middle income countries. You can see India there, you can see Norway here, and the US here. But the issue is that with climate change, the situation is going to change for many people. It means that what we're going to see is more inequalities rather than less inequalities. We know that with climate change, there are changes that are happening, and I don't have the time to really go into them, but there will be movement. People will move. And we can debate a bit about whether there are going to be 24 million who will move, are already displaced, or it will rise to 1.2 billion. But the issue is, in many parts of the world, people will not be able to live. They will not have livelihoods. So we definitely need the global climate action. But in addition, we also need country level adaptation. And we also need to see how we can manage this migration and have climate resilient health systems. The pandemics are not new, though we were all taken by surprise with COVID-19. And of course, the historians, as well as the colleagues who work with infectious diseases, will tell us that this was not the first or the last pandemic that we have seen. But what did the pandemic show us? And the pandemic again showed us that everybody was not affected in the same way. And we see that in the US, and this is US data by race and ethnicity, showing that whether you look at cases, whether you look at hospitalization or death, you will see that there are very many differences according to ethnic group. And you can see that Black or African American, non-Hispanic persons, the differentials were much higher, both for cases as well as for hospitalization and as well as for death. And this is not only about biology. As I said before, it is about the socioeconomic status, access to healthcare, and increased exposure to the virus due to occupation, which includes frontline, essential, and critical infrastructure workers. We also know conflict. We see conflict both is not something new. And again, conflict will come and go. And what happens with conflict is forced displacement. But the crisis should not mask longer trends, because what happens in conflict is, of course, people move to neighboring countries, and these movements are concentrated in space and time. And of course, people move to neighboring countries because they hope that one day they can go home when the conflict is over. But there's high vulnerabilities for refugees and the need for support. But crises also hide that refugees not only seek safety, but they also seek opportunity. They would like to have a good quality of life. They would like to work. And we know that 85% of those moving across borders are not refugees, and I'll come back to that. So what's the elephant in the room? From the fox to the elephant. The elephant in the room is really, again, looking at inequalities and us not being able to address those inequalities. And we say we can't address those inequalities. And that is because of the complexity, because we are unable to chew gum and walk at the same time. And no, that's not the end of my lecture. So I'm going to now show you and make the case for migration and health being a wicked problem and how it falls between the cracks. Know that we can argue about the figures, but there's a lot of heterogeneity when it comes to migration, because migrants are not one faceless, nameless group of people moving across borders, and they differ in skills, gender, legal status, etc., etc. But we know that there are countries of origin and there are countries of destination, and there are voluntary migrants, and there are refugees and families of communities of migrants. So migration and migrants have many faces. So the migrant is not necessarily in a rubber boat. And you can see this when you look at this and see that there are many faces of migrants and migration. So today's migrant could be tomorrow's citizen. And we've seen that as well, that migrants are not necessarily all of them who need help. Many are very resilient, and we forget that. We also forget that migration actually has an extreme advantage. And you also have to look at migration, internal migration in India, for example, where a lot of places would just fall apart if they didn't have workers, and workers are the ones who are moving. So in high income countries, this is particularly important because we see aging and shrinking populations has an unprecedented inversion of geographic pyramid. So immigration is needed to maintain economy and social contracts. In middle and upper income countries, looking at India, for example, the fertility of replacement levels is already taking place as a change, and the demographic pyramid is also starting to invert. So there's an upcoming transformation from immigration to immigration, which means it's happening, but not everybody is going to move. And in low and middle income countries, you see there's a lot of young and booming population, and they would like to move because they don't see any future for themselves in their countries without having the economic development. So what happens to the health of migrants when they move? So if you are very unhealthy, you're very unlikely to move across border, and we call it the healthy migrant effect. There are also theories of ill health or negative effects that after migration, your health changes. You also have the allostatic load, which is when the healthy migrant goes to being the exhausted migrant because of the sum total of physical as well as mental stresses. You have the salmon effect, where after migration, as the migrants get older, they come back to the country of origin, and we've seen some of that happen. Or you can say, actually, there's no difference with migrants and migrants' health. It's just a data artifact. And I will argue that's not the case. I will also say that we have to consider the tale of two cities, because we look at migrants and then we look at vulnerable groups, and we think that there are two different groups, but actually it is all related. And another reason that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, because there are many factors, and we often look at perhaps we've gotten better at looking at the social determinants, but we're not looking at the environmental, political, or cultural determinants of health. And then we say, okay, but being a researcher and a scholar, I'm always talking about evidence. And a 21st century clinician who cannot critically read a study is as unprepared as one who cannot take a blood pressure or examine the cardiovascular system. So it is not about being a researcher, but all of us need that. But the rate of production, do we use the evidence that we have efficiently? And we can see that this has just exploded. Overwhelmed? Not at all. We should see the inside of my head. So I'm going to produce some of the research that I have just as an example of migration and health differences. And of course, I know many people work with nutrition, and I have very good colleagues here who worked with nutrition for a long time. This is some of my own research from Norway. And diet is very much related to the identity. And this is a hypothesis that we have, is whatever is closest to our identity, for example, staples, we change last. But whatever is associated with taste, we change first. And this is what we found among migrants in Norway. And you can see, and the Norwegian population among men and women. And very interestingly, the entire Norwegian population, less than 10%, are drinking full-fat milk every day. Whereas you can see among the migrant groups, this is much higher. And not surprisingly, because it's associated with their identity. And then again, this is some of my work looking at obesity. And of course, we're very familiar with using body mass index. But we see in the case of migrants, you can't just do copy paste, because the body mass index is not actually telling us what is going on. And when you look at the body mass index in relation to the waist hip ratio, you will see in all the ethnic groups that there's a very big difference. Even those who have a lower body mass index have a higher waist hip ratio. So, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And then we said, okay, is this only because they're in Norway? Let's try to compare with the country of destination, with the country of origin. And this is one of my PhD students who looked at the urban Tamils of Kandy with the Sri Lankan Tamils in Oslo. And we found that it was indeed true that when people moved, it was actually detrimental to their health. They were thinner and had better ratios when it comes to the lipid profile in Kandy. So the ethnic differences in health, if you look at this, and I've tried to present it as a spider figure, you can see the glass is half full and half empty. So whereas you can see that for diabetes, women of ethnic minority backgrounds, particularly here it's Pakistan, they're 14 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than Norwegian women. Of course, they're not smokers, they don't consume alcohol, and when it comes to hypertension, it's not bad. And when you look at mental distress, of course, that's high too. This is not only the case of Norway. If you look at Europe, you see similar studies showing that the prevalence of diabetes among migrants is 2 times increased among ethnic minority populations. And this happens much quicker than it would happen in the Indian context. So in India as well, you do see that in the urban populations compared to the rural populations. You're not meant to read this figure because I know it's very complicated and crowded, but it's just to show you that when we look at what is called multimorbidity, where one or two chronic conditions occur at the same time, you will see that there are many patterns between the Norwegians, different patterns for Norwegians, for those who are born in Eastern Europe, Western countries, and other non-Western countries. So this is very important also in clinical practice to look at that and see it's one size doesn't fit all. It's different for different groups. And this is very clearly indicated in our studies on cancer in Norway, where we see that this is good news, halfway, lower incidence than the host population when it comes to lung cancer and liver cancer, but it's a bit different when it comes to stomach cancer. And this is a very important thing, proportion with mental health issues. And we see that in all the different migrant groups in Norway compared to the population, and looking at some of the groups, it's almost 3 times of the population, the proportion with mental health issues. And it doesn't get better with age. So we looked at the elderly and we looked at the use of those with one diagnosis. And we see all the time that those with from other income countries and from high income countries differ when it comes to the Norwegian population. And you can see, for example, that's endocrine as diabetes, of course, and you can see cardiovascular slowly catching up. And also, very interestingly, musculoskeletal. And though musculoskeletal disorders are, the proportion is very high, but it is not something that people pay attention to because it is not considered important enough, because it doesn't contribute to mortality, but morbidity. The other thing that you hear all the time is we don't want these migrants because they are coming and, taking up everything in our healthcare systems, using our services. And when we looked at this in Norway, we did find that actually the migrants compared to the Norwegians do not use the healthcare services as much as the Norwegians. So there are many myths that we have. And we also looked at death risks. And when you look at death risk, you see that there is an advantage. And we can think, oh, does that mean migrants will live longer? No, that's not the news. As soon as they have lived in Norway long enough or in other European countries, they lose the healthy migrant advantage. And then after 25 years, you see that the death risks are more or less the same as the Norwegian population. So we've seen the spectrum of what is going on, and we know that people are ill, they fall ill, and yet we treat them and we send them back to the same conditions that made them sick in the first place. We've had several Lancet commissions now, and 112 and 228 Lancet series, and we'll have a new one coming on climate change, migration, and health. And we actually know that we have a lot of data. And why was this Lancet commission recently commissioned? It was because this is not just about a health crisis, it's about a moral reckoning. And we need to find out, can we reconcile migration with the principles of equity and compassion that underpin European values? So it was quite a task, Herculean task, of having 52 authors, 41 institutes, 16 countries, a bit like herding cats. As you know, researchers are very hard to get to do the things that you want them to do. And the first thing was about prioritization, because there's a lot of agendas in policy. There's the migration governance agenda, development agenda, global health agenda, and this ends up becoming an alphabet soup if I try to sort of summarize all these different acronyms. But what we found is at the bottom of it, there are unmet needs, particularly by income group, even in the EU. And you can see the unmet needs are greatest among the poorest. But how can we address this? How can we solve one of these wicked problems? And this was by priority setting. It means that we have to look at migration health through priority lens setting. We have to look at what are the dilemmas and also look at how this can be better, fairer, and more transparent policies. And one might think priorities, prioritization, priority setting. It's all the same thing. We just need to decide what is the priority, but it's not. Because if you prioritize something up, you have to prioritize something down. And that is very important. So priority setting really looks at, can we provide essential cost-effective services to everyone? Then can we expand it to make it available and affordable? And finally, can we ensure higher coverage? And this is where equity comes in to those who need it the most, the worst of groups. So decision-making is important. You must include those with concerns. The priority setting approach has to be applied. You have to circumvent ad hoc decision-making during crisis. And ultimately, sometimes the people who are left making the ad hoc decisions are the ones who are the lowest in the system. We have to have a closer alignment with what our needs are, and we have to constantly review, analyze, and evaluate. Now I'm going to talk about something which actually prevents us from doing all of this. And there are two things. We have seen the rise of xenophobia. We have seen the rise of racism. It's the fear and hatred or discrimination against those who are considered to be foreigners, or even those who are considered to be different. And racism is about looking at an organized system that affords power and privilege according to an established hierarchy based on racial categories. So racism is basically systemic, interpersonal, internalized. And very often the focus is on individual level. And that is important, but it's the systemic level that we need to focus on. So again, we looked at addressing this in Europe in our series. And the idea was to stimulate the discourse. And I don't have time to go into it. Racism actually has now been documented to shorten the DNA telomeres. We have colleagues in Australia who have said, this is not about our emotions. Of course, it is about emotions as well, but it is also about healthcare. So we need to see what happens, and we need to identify and inspire knowledge gaps and inspire action to prevent and mitigate against this. So we saw and we said, okay, let's select children. Surely everybody loves children and there can't be discrimination. That's not true. Children also of migrant origin experience inequalities. How? Because of inadequate interpretation services, cultural specific barriers, healthcare professional bias. Sorry, that went too quickly. And why? Why is it important? Because it had an impact, and children know there's a life cycle perspective. It will stay with them throughout their lives. So we need to know what is happening. We need to share these examples. We need to have research to understand this, and we need the data for changing policy and practice. Strengthening vaccine uptake, we saw that during COVID, we knew that this was a real issue, and especially among migrant populations, but we can't do it without co-design, co-production. You have to involve the people. If you want to see behavior change, and all our case control studies will show us regarding what kind of behavior we're trying to change, that unless we include and deal with communication issues, the power dynamics, the culture, the practicalities, the role clarification, we're not going to be successful. We also know that, and I'm very happy to be in my alma mater, so this is very important, we need the capacity building in the higher education institutions. And for capacity building, we have to share. We need spaces to share. We need to work with programs for trainers and teachers. We need to improve attitudes and skills. We need to have both top-down and bottom-up, involving teachers and students, curricular development, education accreditations. We need to look at student assessments. So there's a lot to do, and basically the road is long and we've just started. But you can't really know where you're going until you know where you have been. So we have to stop looking and working like the tale of two cities in silos. We have to look at the synergy. We have to see that it is like this, the chair that you see here, or the stool. And if you see that if you don't have equity, sustainability, and resilience, it's not going to work. So we have to start looking at things at the same time, because everything is connected. And even in the case of migrant health, the ill health just doesn't result from one thing. It's many things acting together. It's discrimination, it's poverty, it's entitlements, it's looking at nutrition, physical activity, other risk factors, including genetics, and everything hangs together. And therefore, we have to think of the third thing in nature. We've talked about the fox, the elephant, and now this is the bee. And it means that we have to manage complexity. We cannot say it's so complex that we can't do anything. And managing complexity is really at the core of walking and chewing gum at the same time, something called intersectionality. Because a person is not just a man, but or a woman, is also young, old, has disability, may have a different sexual orientation. There's geography, ancestry, there's so many things. You have to look at the person as a whole, and you can't look at each of these characteristics separately. You also have to look at how they interact with each other. So it's about managing complexity. When it comes to the globe, we need to decolonize minds. It's not about, I know more than you and you know less than me, I'm more superior. At the end of the day, the question should be, what can I learn from you? Are we willing? Are we open to learning from each other? And this is all about decolonizing global health. If we don't have that, it will be repeat with colonial remnants. When we look at the standards, whether you look at hemoglobin, for example, in China, when I was working, I found that 80% of a village had anemia. But it's because the standards we're using to measure anemia have not been calibrated for that particular population. Or if you look at the breastfeeding guidelines, they were built on bottle-fed babies in the US. And in my own PhD, I showed that the Framingham study, which was done among 60 people and generated the cardiovascular risk approach, doesn't work for migrants, particularly those from South Asia. So we know that there's a lot of these colonial remnants in everything we do, in diagnosis, in treatment, and in management. So we need to see that these injustices do not continue and lead to ideologies and practices. And global health needs to be redefined to enhance equity and justice. And we have to look at critical reassessment and system reforms. And does investment in global health bring socioeconomic development, or would it be the other way around? So we have to also be acutely aware of the lingering impact of colonial legacies on current educational programs, such as at our institutions across the world. And we have to look at how knowledge generated in high-income countries can be to the detriment of knowledge in low-income countries, and how decolonized perspectives lack sufficient attention in educational programs. Recently, I've been working in Nepal, where the psychiatry curriculum has not been changed for 25 years, and some of it is completely out of date, but it is a remnant, and therefore there are increasing calls for critical reflection, collateral action, to shift paradigms towards more equitable knowledge and learning. Finally, we have to look at the causes of the causes. We have to look at, we cannot just say, of course, as medical practitioners, as healthcare providers, we need to deal with the patient, but we have to send the patient back to where they came from. And therefore, causes of the causes is very important. We cannot focus only on those who are disadvantaged. We also have to have actions that must be universal. And the scale and intensity that is proportionate to the level of disadvantage, this is what is called proportionate universalism. So though we have to be universal at the same time, it has to be proportionate. Darwin's unfortunate legacy. Darwin said the world is hostile. Constant struggle for survival. Error leads to death. Life is an accident, one of many random events. Things outside are fixed, independent, must dominate, control, survival, the great minute. But maybe Darwin was wrong, I would like to argue. Life is about invention, not just survival. We are here to create, not defend. Everything is in a constant process of discovery and creating. Life organizes and seeks systems so that more may flourish. And life is a great playground we make as we go. So I do want to leave you with that positive message. You have to know yourself, and you have to be the change that you want to see in the world, is what Gandhi said. It's been a long journey for me. And as you can see here, I don't know if you can read it, it's a physician's update from 1988. And this was the first article published by me along with Dr. Kothare on medical emergencies. And I would really like to thank my alma mater. I wouldn't have made it to everything else that came without St. John's and everything that St. John's has given me. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Bernadette, for that perspective on global and migrant health, and that all men are in fact not created equal. I would like to call our Dean, Dr. George D'Souza, and Dr. Tony Raj, and the Alumni Association President, Dr. Anthony Robert, to felicitate Dr. Bernadette Nirmal Kumar. We now move on to the next part of today's event, the Sister Dr. Mary Glowry Award, 2024, the highest award from the St. John's Medical College Alumni Association. I would like to request Sister Dr. Presti to tell us about the Sister Dr. Mary Glowry Award.
Good afternoon, everyone. Introduction to Sister Mary Glory Award 2024. Sister Dr. Mary Glory was an Australian physician and Catholic religious sister celebrated for her pioneering work in medical missionary service in India. She was born on November 23, 1887 in Viregura, Victoria, Australia. She pursued medicine at the University of Melbourne and graduated in 1910, becoming one of the first women in Australia to practice medicine. During her medical practice in Melbourne, she focused on improving healthcare for women and children. Inspired by a sermon in 1916 about the lack of medical care for women and children in India, Mary felt called to devote her life to this cause. She joined the religious congregation of the Society of Jesus Mary Joseph in Guntur in India in 1920. As Sister Mary Glory, she dedicated herself to healthcare, education, and social work, particularly focusing on marginalized communities. It became clear to Sister Dr. Mary Glory from the time she arrived in India that the challenges she faced could not be tackled by a single person. A much greater effort was needed to unite people from across India for a common cause. In her own words, it was while making the Stations of the Cross in the novitiate one day in 1921 that I received the inspiration that what was really needed in India to train future medical personnel was a Catholic medical college. On April 21st, 1944, in Bangalore, the Catholic Hospital Association passed a resolution stating the association aims at the establishment of a Catholic medical college. Unfortunately, Sister Dr. Mary Glory did not live to see her vision come to fruition. She passed away in Bangalore in 1957 after a prolonged battle with cancer. Despite her immense contribution and being instrumental in the idea of Catholic Medical College, she remained a picture of humility until the end. In recognition of her legacy, the alumni of St. John's Medical College, who have served rural or marginalized population for at least 10 years, in keeping with college's mission, are honored with Sister Dr. Mary Glory Award. This special annual award is instituted in 2015, acknowledges alumni serving vulnerable and marginalized populations. It also aims to inspire students, faculty, and others at St. John's Medical College to pursue lives of service.
It is my privilege to call our Sister Dr. Mary Glory awardee for 2024, Sister Dr. Vijaya Sharma. Sister, could you please join us on stage? I would also like to invite the Dean, Dr. George D'Souza, the CMS, Dr. Arvind Kasturi, Dr. Mario Vaz, and Dr. Anthony Robert to join Sister Dr. Vijaya Sharma on stage while the citation is being read by Dr. Pradvi.
It is my privilege today to read a citation for Sister Dr. Vijay Sharma. Sister Dr. Mary Glory Award 2024. Sister Dr. Vijay Sharma belongs to the Congregation of Sisters of Mercy of the Holy Cross. You did MBBS in Darbhanga Medical College, Darbhanga, Bihar, and graduated in 1978. You got degree in Masters of Surgery from St. John's Medical College, Bangalore, Karnataka in 1987. You worked for 38 years in Luru Hospital, that is for 11 years, back and forth in Rajapuri, Kunkuri, Belatan, and Kunkuri as per need. Then from June 1998 onwards, completely at Holy Cross Hospital, Rajipur. That's for the last 23 years. After post-graduation, you worked at Holy Cross Dispensary, Rajipur, which you developed into a 25-bedded rural hospital with a well-equipped OT good enough for the village setting. As a dedicated healthcare professional, you pioneered comprehensive initiatives focusing on elderly care, mobile clinics, vaccination campaigns, school health checks, and rehabilitation programs for disabled children. You also targeted disease-specific initiatives for leprosy and tuberculosis, collaborating with local health centers, international organizations, NGOs, and government agencies. Your leadership roles include serving as a member of governing board and two-term president of the Catholic Health Association of India, CHAI. Internationally, you represented India at the Asian Federation of Catholic Medical Association in Bali, Indonesia, and presented a paper on CHAI's work in India. Additionally, you were invited to the Vatican, Rome, to present at the Third International Congress on Health Ministry of Church in India, showcasing a PHC-based model to meet health needs. Through all the many ups and downs in your life, your faith that the Lord provides you everything has kept you blessed. You have worked alone, day and night, in the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter, with the energy and the joy the Lord has given you. Sister Dr. Vijaya Sharma, your greatness lies in your faithfulness to your vocation as a doctor and a sister for the poor. Your determination in fulfilling this role with the full of an apostolic zeal and untiring enthusiasm is an inspiration to all of us. The St. John's Medical College Alumni Association lauds your life of service and bestows upon you the highest award of the association for your dedicated service to the underserved, In the spirit of Christ and in keeping with the mission of St. John's Medical College, your alma mater. Please join. Please give a huge round of applause.
I would like to invite Sister Dr. Vijaya Sharma to say a few words.
Good afternoon, dear friends, and everyone present in this hall. I deem it an honor and a privilege to stand before you today, before this August gathering. Thank you for choosing me for this year's Sister Dr. Mary Glory Award, bestowing me with such a great honor. I consider it a great privilege, and I am honored to receive this recognition, and I am grateful for the acknowledgement of my service among the underprivileged population in different parts of India, and presently at Rajipur, Dinajpur district of West Bengal, for more than 38 years. I am humbled by this gesture. I express my heartfelt gratitude to each of you for your valuable presence here today. This event has been a remarkable experience filled with inspiring talks and valuable insights. Sure, the credit goes to the speaker of the Jayashree Thomas Memorial Award, Dr. Bernadette Nirmal. Thanks and congratulations, Doctor. I am also grateful to the directors and the deans of this prestigious institution, and particularly to the present director, Reverend Father Yesudas Rajamanikam, Reverend Dr. J. Charles Davis, the Associate Director, Associate Director, Finance, Reverend Father Tony A.J., MSFS, and the Dean, Dr. George A.D. D'Souza. Sure, I am grateful to the whole administration of St. John's National Academy of Health Sciences. My special thanks to St. John's Medical College Alumni Association and its executive committee members, Dr. Anthony Charles and co, for their decision, planning, contribution, hard work, generous services, which has made this event a memorable one. My memory goes back to my years at St. John's, 1984 to 87. My heart fills with joy as well as with gratitude to late Bishop Ignatius Pinto, the then administrator of St. John's, who later handed over the responsibility to Father Percival Fernandez, presently the Bishop Emeritus of the Archdiocese of Mumbai. Their guidance, understanding, love, and concern for all the sister doctors deserve a special mention. Those were the tough times of duty and learning. Hardly found time to use the library or to study. Often, we would be pulling the dressing trolley, completing our patient's record, making summaries, discharge summaries, till late at night. It was a regular feature to notice Bishop Pinto on night rounds along the corridors of the hospital. Noticing us occupied with work, he would approach us and inquire about our studies and well-being. I bow my head in Shraddhanjali to my mentor, late Dr. Alfred Mascarenhas, the then head of the Department of Surgery. He was a father figure, very strict but understanding, friendly but humane. He dealt with us like equals. He was a real inspiration and encouragement to all. Another special person whom I would like to mention is Dr. P.P. Maya, the head of Surgery Unit 2, and his assistant associate professor, Dr. Nand Kumar. Their love, concern, dedication, cordial relationship, unassuming manner of dealing with us PGs were indeed edifying and exemplary. Our unit was called picnic unit because Dr. Maya will take us, the whole group, for a party every now and then, either to his own hotel owned by his family or elsewhere. Even though those were times of study and learning, such outings eased our burden and gave relaxation. They were teachers, instructors, and guides with a difference. They inculcated such capabilities on me that I have been confident to discharge my duties to this day efficiently. I gratefully acknowledge the support of the various departments of St. John's Academy, which we had to associate with. My batchmates, from whom I am completely cut off today, namely Dr. Raja and Dr. Leo Meneges, I thank and wish them God's blessings. They were not only my batchmates, but real brothers to me. They stood by me always. I did not know the language of this place. It was hard for me. And along with that, especially when I fell sick for weeks together, they were replacing me at on-call duties and beside their own schedule. I am surely grateful to my Holy Cross community at Davis Road, Flushing Town. They were real support and strength during those years of mine at Bangalore. They were ready to help in every circumstance so that I was able to complete my study. Thank you, dear sisters. And I thank my sisters who are present here to share my joy. If I count the blessings, they are numerous. I thank one for being, all of you, for being part of my journey. Last but not the least, I fold my hands in gratitude to each one of you present here today, who has made this event a memorable one. May God bless each one of you and reward you. And I raise my hands and heart in gratitude to God Almighty and pray to Him whose power working in us can do much more than we can ever think of or imagine. To Him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Once again, a big thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Sister Vijaya Sharma, for those very heartfelt words. This brings us to the end of today's event, and I would like to invite Dr. Diane D'Souza to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, one and all. Considering I'm the only person now standing between you and the high tea, I'll keep this as brief as possible. I would like to say a few thank yous on behalf of the Alumni Association. And first and foremost, thank you so much, dear Dr. Bernadette, for coming here, for being here, for accepting our invitation, and for giving an oration so befitting the memory of a Johnite we hold so dear. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mary, for introducing your dear friend and batchmate to all of us, and to Dr. Rajalakshmi for sharing those wonderful memories with all of us. Dr. M.J. Thomas, sir, thank you so much. Dr. Maya, and special thanks to Rohit, who's joining us online all the way from Vietnam. Sister Dr. Vijay Sharma, thank you so much. You're an inspiration. And being from general surgery, having studied general surgery, I can understand what you went through. And thank you so much for being the inspiration for all of us in this department. Dear Reverend Father Josudas, Father Charles, Father Tony, Father John, our respected Dean College, Dean SDRI, and our CMS of the hospital, thank you so much for your constant support and encouragement. To our fellow Johnites across the globe who are joining in online, thank you. Thank you, Cyril, for your dedication and help. The IT support team and the support staff in this auditorium, thank you so much. And finally, a loud applause is in order for Dr. Anjali Olapalli, who organized the oration and coordinated everything so smoothly. I now invite all Johnites and all gathered here to join us for the high tea. Yeah, and then a very important invite on 13th December, please mark the dates on your calendar, 13th December, 7:30 p.m., the Christmas dinner of the Alumni Association, inviting all of you to register with Cyril just outside the auditorium before proceeding for high tea. Thank you so much.